Hi, I'm Kathy Smith, the director of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society here at Community College of Philadelphia. In today's Perspective interview, David Travaskis, Center board member and pro bono counsel to the PA Bar, speaks to Deborah Klehr, the executive director of the Education Law Center in Philadelphia, about the important work of the Law Center. I think you'll find this interview fascinating.
Hello, welcome to the Perspective series of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society on CCP TV, the Emmy-nominated educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Travaskis, an adjunct professor here in paralegal studies. Today's guest is Deborah Klehr, the head of the Educational Law Center here in Philadelphia. Now, you are the executive director of the Education Law Center. Can you tell our audience what that is?
Yes. The Education Law Center is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization. Our mission is to ensure access to quality public education for all children in Pennsylvania. And we have three priority areas where we carry out this mission. Our first area is around fairness in school funding, so ensuring that all children in Pennsylvania can receive an adequate education at an adequately funded school. Our second area is around dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, and we can talk a little bit about what that entails in ensuring fairness in school discipline. And our final area is around equal access, making sure that children have access to school.
Now how do you do this?
We carry out our mission through a lot of different ways. We do direct legal representation, we do impact litigation, we do policy work on the local, state, and federal levels. We work with parents, we train community groups, so there are a lot of different ways that we're advocates.
Well, why don't we start with direct legal action? If somebody watching this had a problem that involved education, involved a school, involved how their child was being treated, could they come to you and ask for help, legal help?
Yes, we have a helpline, and so parents or sometimes adults who work with juveniles or youth in different fields will call us, we'll call our helpline, and we give out legal advice and information over the phone. Sometimes we make a referral to another attorney who'd be more appropriate to handle the case, and sometimes we'll handle the case, depending on what the issue is. So, for example, we recently received a phone call from a parent whose child had Down syndrome, and the mom was trying to enroll the child in school, and a school said, oh, we don't take children with Down syndrome in our school. We can't enroll the child, which of course is blatantly illegal. Our public schools need to enroll the students who meet the enrollment criteria, which is just proof of age, proof of residency, proof of immunizations, and an Act 26 statement which says they're not currently expelled from another school for possession of a weapon. So that is all you need to enroll. So that parent called us, and we've helped the parent navigate the particular school to ensure that the child could be enrolled and receive the services to which she's legally entitled.
And did that happen?
Yes.
So that is nice. Now, so that's the example of direct legal impact, but you talked about impact legal action. What does that mean?
So it could mean a couple of different things. In the traditional sense, it might mean that we file a class action. For example, we filed a class action on behalf of limited English proficient parents of students with...
And can you just explain what a class action is so that the audience knows that?
So instead of representing just one student or one family, we're representing a number of students and families on behalf of a class of similarly situated children or families who are in the same position. So we may be, having named a few plaintiffs, a few children, and a few parents, but it's on behalf of lots of other children who are also maybe have disabilities or are being disciplined or whatever the actual issue is. Mm-hmm. So in one particular case, we filed this class action on behalf of parents who are limited English proficient and have students with disabilities. They weren't getting their any documents translated or interpreted for them. So we filed a lawsuit in court on behalf of those parents and those families. But we also do other, we call impact work. For example, in the school discipline context, we filed a complaint against the state of Pennsylvania because the state disciplines a disproportionate number of African American students and students with disabilities. So we filed a complaint with the Department of Justice showing all of the data that many school districts are sending to these disciplinary programs certain numbers of students, certain types of students.
And the idea there, both in the class action and in these complaints, is rather than taking a case one at a time where it might take years and years before big changes are made, here you make the complaint and hopefully the whole state will change how it behaves.
Right. It still might take years and years before changes are made, but the idea is that instead of it only being on behalf of one particular student, you're really doing it for the whole, for the whole system, and you're trying to really make big changes, whether it's, new policies, new practices, new laws, et cetera, that the state or a district or, whatever the particular issue is would change.
Okay. Now, can you give an example of a case like that, a big impact case that the Education Law Center has handled to a conclusion that was a positive one for the community?
Well, we had a case a few years ago where students who were living in a group home, so many of them had been adjudicated dependent. So what that means is they were taken away from their parents for some reason, maybe abuse or neglect or some reason that the child.
But these were really needy children.
Very needy children, and for some reason they weren't able to be placed in a foster home. So they were put all together in a group home, and there was no allegation that these students had done anything to deserve school discipline. They just were living together in a group home. But the school district in this case made them all go to school by themselves, not the regular neighborhood school where the group home was located, but a classroom in a building just for the students because they were living in a group home. And law is very clear that that's illegal, that they should be educated with their peers. The only other peers in the building was also used as a discipline program. So the students who were of varying abilities, ages, grades were all put together in one classroom because they all lived in a group home. So that was illegal. We filed a class action on behalf of the students who were there at the time, but also on behalf of students who had been there previously and weren't able to go to school where they should be going to school. And we were successful in that case, and as a result, those students were able to go to the regular school. Students in the future will be able to go to that regular school, and the students who had been harmed, who had been placed into that single classroom, were able to have additional resources, compensatory education if they had special education needs, to make sure that they could catch up and get the services that they need and help down the road.
Now, if the law is so clear on this, why do schools do things like that?
I think sometimes, although the law is clear, maybe it doesn't trickle down to the actors, to the teachers or to the administrators making decisions. Sometimes they get bad advice from their lawyers, or they get no advice from their lawyers, and they're not giving services to students.
Do you find sometimes that you don't have to make a lawsuit out of it, just by giving the information to the school district, they'll respond?
Absolutely, and I think some school districts in particular have attorneys, another word for attorney is counselor, and they counsel their client. They counsel the school district to say, in fact, federal law or state law requires that you provide these education services to your students. I got this call from Deborah Klehr at the Education Law Center, or any of my colleagues, and you need to be providing these services to Johnny. And so we do find that simply picking up the phone and advocating for a particular client or student can be successful. Sometimes you're not successful until you actually file something, and then it will settle, because then the school district will say, okay, well,
they know you're serious.
Right. And sometimes, we try to change policy either locally at the school district or in Harrisburg or in Washington, D.C., so that it's not me picking up the phone to intervene on behalf of one student, but that the state is doing the right thing or setting the tone, or So
and helping all students.
Exactly.
Now, you also said earlier that you're involved in an equitable school funding system. How are schools in Pennsylvania, public schools, funded right now?
Great question, David. Schools across the country are funded from three sources: federal dollars, state dollars, and local dollars. And Pennsylvania is much more dependent on local dollars than most other states. And the state does make up some share of it, but they're really not paying enough, frankly. And so as a result, a child's zip code determines the quality of his or her education, which is just unfair.
Now, I grew up in Swarthmore, which is a nice zip code, had wonderful schools, wonderful benefits. 3 miles away is Chester, whose zip code includes very poor areas. And none of the schools there didn't have the same funding. Is that just because of the luck of the draw of where you are located?
So there are a number of factors in this. One piece of it, like I said, is that local share. But if you have a school district that is dependent on property taxes to generate the dollars for the local share, and that district may be taxing themselves at a very high rate, but that high rate doesn't generate much income because there's not much to tax. I mean, the property values are low. That district the state isn't making up for that by giving them more. And so that's one piece of the problem, that these certain poorer school districts can't make the money themselves, can't generate the money themselves. But the other part is the way that the state drives out its dollars is unfair and it's inadequate. The way right now that Pennsylvania drives dollars to districts is basically based on what that district got the year before, and loosely on average daily membership, how many students are in that district. It is not based on the actual needs of each district. So, for example, most states have a funding formula. That formula doesn't just take into account how many students are in the district, but it takes into account student factors and district factors. At this point, Pennsylvania is one of only a handful of states that doesn't have a funding formula.
And some student factors would be, if I have a high number of special needs children, they're going to cost more money to educate. So that might be a student factor that we would consider?
Although Pennsylvania does have a special education formula that is separate from a basic education
So that we're
formula.
taking care of.
We're taking care of, although there's a pretty large loophole right now in that. Around June 2014, the legislature passed a formula which we had advocated for to take into account not only how many students with disabilities a district has, but the type of disability. Because if a child gets speech once a week, that costs a lot less than the child who needs full-time emotional support. And before this funding formula for special education came to be, a district got the same average amount regardless of the type of disability the district was actually serving. It wasn't based on the actual needs. Now there are 3 tiers, 3 categories of funding based on the type of disability. There is a loophole at this moment because charter schools are exempt from those 3 tiers, and they're still receiving an average payment, regardless of the fact that they, in fact, serve many fewer students who need that full-time emotional support and many more students, relatively speaking, who need speech once a week.
Gotcha. But so what are the student factors that our current formulas don't take into account?
Right. So a good formula, funding formula that most other states have, would take into account student factors like poverty and English language learners. And so in June 2015, the Pennsylvania's Basic Education Funding Commission did recommend that Pennsylvania adopt a formula and that it would take into account poverty, and in a couple of different ways. One is just how poor, so extreme poverty below 100% of the poverty line, poor, which is slightly above that, and then poverty concentration, because if you have a district that has over 30% of its students who are extremely poor, it is more expensive to provide an adequate education to those students.
And all those factors fit Philadelphia, right?
Those factors fit Philadelphia, absolutely, and a lot of other districts across the state as well. Another student factor is English language learners. So we know that that it costs more to adequately provide an education to a student who is learning English, so that the number of English language learners would be another student factor. And then many formulas take into account district factors.
And what are those?
So the example I gave earlier around a district like right near Philadelphia, William Penn School District, taxes itself at an extremely high rate, but the property values are really low. So a district factor would take into account tax effort and tax capacity. How hard is this district trying to generate money, but also how realistic is it they will be able to generate money? So you take that into account, and then a good formula assigns weights for that, and then the money driven out from the state would take that into account and, in essence, reward a district more if they have a higher tax effort and a lower tax capacity. Other district factors include sparsity or density. If you're a very rural school, you don't have the economies of scale, and maybe you need an additional weight to take that into account.
Right. I always say we have poverty here in Philadelphia that we can see. When you get into the rural areas where the poverty is so spread out, in many ways it's harder to deal with.
Right.
So you're saying the formulas would take that into account as well.
Right. And of course, even if you have a great formula with the right weights and the right factors, the formula is only as good as the dollars you send through it. So you could have a great formula, but if you're only talking about sending a couple $100 million through that formula while you have, for example, $5.7 billion being sent out the way it was sent out last year, not based on actual dollars, or not based on actual needs of the districts, and that's kind of how we've been doing it in Pennsylvania, it's going to take a long time to close the gaps. And I think it's important to note that Pennsylvania has the biggest gap in the country between what the wealthiest school districts pay for education and what the poorest school districts.
And what do you mean by that?
That the average cost of an education in the wealthiest school district in Pennsylvania.
So let's pick one of the ones around Philadelphia. Let's say Lower Merion, somewhere like that, or
right,
New Hope,
Radnor,
Salisbury.
Right, exactly. May be spending, they're spending a lot more than our poorest school districts, and that gap between what they can spend and what our poorest school district can spend is the biggest in the nation. And in addition, we also have seen, I've seen some graphs recently of the disparities around race. Districts that have more African American students have fewer dollars, are spending fewer dollars on education. And that is an alarming statistic as well. So I have also seen graphs that map out what Pennsylvania would look like if we were sending money through a formula that did take into account those weights. And it does shrink the gap between both of those gaps that I mentioned.
Between rich and poor, and also between minority and non-minority.
Yes.
Now, the Education Law Center advocates for policy. The Education Law Center educates people about this. But with this funding, you've actually been involved now in some litigation. So what's the basis of your lawsuit for that?
Well, that's right. Along with the Public Interest Law Center and a private law firm, the Education Law Center filed a lawsuit in the fall of 2014 against the state of Pennsylvania for failure to fund our schools. And the basis, we have two arguments. One is around the Equal Protection Clause in the state constitution, and one is around the Education Clause.
So the Equal Protection Clause of the state constitution basically says?
What I wanted to really focus on is that in a lot of in our neighboring state like New Jersey, they have a similar clause, education clause that Pennsylvania has, which says that the General Assembly shall maintain a system of thorough and efficient education.
Right, and that's what our Constitution says, a thorough and efficient system of education.
Right, and so many other states have similarly phrased state constitutions. This doesn't come from the federal constitution. The right to an education is really state by state.
Right, the federal constitution is silent about education, even though we know the feds do a lot with education.
Right, although there's a federal equal protection clause too, which can apply to education in the sense that once you create that education system, like through your state constitution, thorough and efficient clause or whatever, you can't discriminate, for example.
Right.
But so in Pennsylvania, we have this thorough and efficient clause, And the argument is that the General Assembly has really abdicated that responsibility because the system is so underfunded.
And other states have taken that same language and have done things to change their educational system.
That's right. In other states, the courts have said, hey, General Assembly, you're not doing what the state constitution requires you to do. Now, the courts don't come in and say, you need to fund $3.6 billion more in education. That's not their role. Their role is to tell the General Assembly that the General Assembly needs to do that. And so...
but the Pennsylvania courts have never said that, right?
The Pennsylvania courts have said that it's not justiciable, which means they've said this is not an issue for the courts to decide. It's a political question, and the General Assembly and the governor should figure it out. We don't believe that's the case, and in fact, there's a lot of case law and facts to back up that the court has a role in upholding the Constitution. And the last case around this in Pennsylvania, which was several decades ago, focused on, or one of the cases focused on the fact that there were no judicially manageable standards by which a court could measure whether or not a system of education was thorough and efficient. But a lot of things have changed because now we have state standards, we have state assessments, and a lot of measures to show whether or not, what the outcomes are for students, and that a court could use that now.
A court could go in and say, we have these standardized tests, and Philadelphia is scoring at a very low level on those. Some of these better resource schools are scoring at a high level, and that means that we need to have more equitable funding.
Yeah, and they could also measure inputs, measure what we're putting into the schools, in addition to measuring outputs. So there are a lot of different ways, but we haven't even had an opportunity to make the argument that our schools are inadequately funded or that we don't have a system, a thorough and efficient system of education, because right now we're really talking about whether we're fighting to
get the courts to actually consider it.
Exactly.
Now, this is not just the Philadelphia School District bringing this lawsuit. There are other school districts across the state that feel they're being similarly left out, right?
Exactly. And in fact, the School District of Philadelphia is not one of the district plaintiffs in the suit, although we have school districts who are plaintiffs in the suit and students who are plaintiffs in the suit, and some of the families are from Philadelphia, but statewide, I mean, this is an urban problem, this is a suburban problem, this is a rural problem that we need to address. And our hope is that this case will allow the courts to step in and tell the General Assembly that they need to adequately fund education and create a system that we don't have right now in Pennsylvania.
How confident are you about this line of litigation? Is this something that we may be looking at for the next 10 years, 20 years? I mean, or is it something do you think the courts are ready to handle?
I hope that the court is ready to handle this. I believe that they have an obligation to handle this, and I hope that the justices agree with me. But we have multiple strategies. I mean, I think that's the important, when you're in advocacy, you have to have multiple strategies to do anything. So we talked about doing individual representation and impact litigation and policy work and trainings and communities, and I think it's the same in all of our areas. So in school funding, at the same time that we're suing the state to try to get the courts to play their role, we're also working collaboratively with the legislature in collaboration with 50 other organizations through the Campaign for Fair Education Funding to work proactively with the legislature, not only on a formula, but also on funding that formula and making sure that an adequate amount of money is sent through a formula to meet the needs of our students across the state.
Which is an amazing thing. How did you come into this position? I mean, obviously you're a lawyer, you went to law school, but were you always interested in education, or is this something that just sort of you fell into? And what really is your career path to get you to where you are now?
Well, I have always been interested in education. My focus area in college was on urban education policy, so I've stayed the course.
And you were a teacher for a little bit, right?
Exactly. After college, I taught kindergarten and first grade. And then I went to law school, and my focus area in law school was really on civil rights issues, education issues, special education issues, after law school, I clerked for a federal judge in New York. And then I was lucky enough to get a public interest fellowship to the Education Law Center. So that was a little over 10 years ago that I started as an attorney at the Education Law Center, and I stayed, and I'm happily still here as the executive director.
And for our audience, I know so many people watching this have children they care about, parents, grandparents, our kinship care. They all are looking for help. I know when people call the Education Law Center, it's very unlikely that my case is going to be the case you're going to embrace, just because there's so much need out there. But you guys have a lot of other resources that are available. And can you share with our audience some of those resources that are there?
Sure. We have a great project right now called Student Discipline Advocacy Service. We work with local law students, so it's Temple Law School students and Penn Law School students and Drexel, and we've just done a training to include Villanova. We're starting to expand to the western part of the state with the University of Pittsburgh. But the model is that we train law students on the educational rights of students in discipline hearings, like expulsion hearings or transfers to alternative education.
Right, because you don't have a right to have an attorney at an expulsion hearing or a suspension or any of those.
Right, you don't have, well, you have the right to have an attorney, but you
don't have the right to have one provided for you.
Exactly.
Right.
And so you can bring an attorney, but you can also bring an advocate. So we train law students on the educational rights of students in these discipline hearings. There's a lot of due process rights that the students are entitled to tell their side of the story, to ask questions, to bring witnesses, to question witnesses, et cetera. And so we train law students on these rights, and then sometimes go with them at first, or they go with another law student who's done it before, to be the advocate for a child in an expulsion hearing. And it has really made a marked difference in the opportunities for our K-12 students facing discipline, because they have a law student who can come and be an advocate.
And they're not paying for that law student.
No,
that's
exactly.
a pro bono
it's volunteer.
Service.
And we have an we just have extraordinary law students who are really passionate and really good, and they can, in many cases, be able to go to the hearing with the family to advocate, to say this child should not be expelled. Here are the facts. Here's the background, and bring up relevant information. It can be very overwhelming for a family to go to this type of hearing alone. It's the student, maybe a parent, and then a lot of administrators from the school district, and the lawyer from the school district.
That can be very intimidating. So that's one project. You also have just a wealth of materials on your webpage that are really incredibly up-to-date and good materials. And how would people get that?
Thank you for asking. If you go to www.elc-pa.org, you can access a lot of our publications by subject area, so by special education, foster care, fairness in school discipline, whatever the topic is. We have some documents that are really geared towards parents, and some documents that are geared towards attorneys who are representing families. And we try to provide as many resources as we can. We know that we can't handle all of these individual cases. You may not get to have an Education Law Center attorney go with you to your hearing, but we hope to at least be able to provide some materials or a referral so that families and their children can have access to the legal services to which they're entitled.
I'm hoping our audience will look to that website and look for materials if they have a need, and if they have a case, they can call you and maybe see if they'll be the lucky one that you guys can help. Deborah, our time is up. I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for the work you do, and I want to thank you for being here. You've been watching the Perspective series of Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society on CCP TV, the Emmy-nominated educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Travaskis, an adjunct professor here in paralegal studies. We will see you next time on CCP TV.